The whole point of Prohibition is to make it illegal to sell wine. It wasn't illegal to make wine. You can go into a grocery store and you would find a rack of grapes in the vegetable section, fruits and vegetables, and there would be a sign with instructions on how to make your own wine.
Wow.
And it would be horrible.
As you probably know, the wine industry in California goes back some 250 years from when the Franciscan Padres brought wine grapes and vines to California, and then through its growth in the 19th century until it really exploded in the 20th century. So today, my guest, Kevin Ferguson, is going to talk to us about a really interesting piece of pivotal California wine industry history. And there's a direct link between Mission Santa Clara and the Jesuit fathers who took that over in the 1850s, and then later what happened to bring California wines to the forefront of the world wine industry. So I want to thank you, Kevin, for being here, and maybe you could tell us a little bit about yourself and how this story got onto your radar.
Absolutely. This is great to be with you, Damien. And yeah, so we're embarking on the 50th anniversary of the Judgment of Paris, and that is the landmark event that transformed the wine industry worldwide, really, when two California wines blindly were picked by 9 French judges, no less, over the French elite wines in a famous blind tasting in Paris. And so that happened on May 24th, 1976, and we're just on that 50th anniversary.
So how tell us a little bit about what your background is and how this connects to you.
Yeah, so I grew up in a wine family. My great-grandfather was a winemaker in Italy and immigrated to California, and then in 1912, and my grandfather, Grandpa Mario Gemello, took it over, and he has a tie-in to the Judgment of Paris. He was actually retired in 2002 when they did a reenactment of the Judgment of Paris, a 25th anniversary rematch. Lo and behold, my grandfather's wine ended up winning that tasting, and it wasn't even supposed to be in the tasting, but it won 14 out of 16 judges chose the Gemello Cabernet, the 1970 Gemello Cabernet, as the number one wine in the tasting, and the 2 judges that didn't picked it as the second best wine in that tasting. And so in my great-grandfather and my grandfather, they ran their winery all throughout the 20th century, starting in Prohibition, after Prohibition, and throughout the 20th century.
So how did your grandfather get his start in the wine industry?
So, well, he was my grandfather, Grandpa Mario, was 17 years old in 1934. He was a senior at Mountain View Union High School when Prohibition got repealed, and so he helped his father, John Gemello, or Giovanni Gemello, to relaunch the Gemello winery. But he was great-grandpa Gemello, came from Italy in 1912. He was a winemaker and had a vineyard in Piedmont, northern Italy. And he was struggling, 3 out of 4 years. He was working, when he was in his 20s, he was working at Martini and Rossi sparkling vineyards. And then in the evenings, he would tend to his own grapes. And 3 out of 4 years, the harsh winters would wipe out his crops. And he was getting frustrated. He had friends who had already emigrated to California, and they would write him letters and say, look, you're making 10 cents a day in Italy, or making $1 a day in California. You should come out and join us. And ultimately he did.
Wow. So it's funny. My grandfather, my father's father, came to the United States, came to California in 1912, also from
Wow.
Austro-Hungary,
Okay.
but was their region of Dalmatia had for a long time been under Venice, and so there's a lot of Italian tie-ins there as well.
Right.
But Martini and Rossi, they're still in business. I reckon
Yeah.
they make vermouth, right?
Yep.
And
That's what I knew of them from. I bartended out of college and actually during college, and that's the brand of vermouth that we were making. We were using for martinis.
okay, so
Yeah.
when your great grandfather then came to California, where did he wind up settling, and how did he get into the business here?
Yeah, so that's actually a fascinating story, and this takes us even back to the 19th century. He did come in 1912, but he landed a job at Almaden Vineyards, which was run by Paul Masson. Now, Paul Masson, in the 1800s, he came from France, an immigrant from France. He would eventually be known as the Champagne King of California. But when he first came here, he landed a job at New Almaden, it was called, run by Charles Lafranc. And that became one, if not the first, one of the first commercially run wineries in California. And in 1878, I think Charles Lafranc was killed by a runaway, and so he ended up handing down in his will to his three children. One of them was a woman, Louise, who Paul Masson was actually dating and eventually married the next year. But he wasn't loving being part of. He wanted to run his own shop, and he also was. I think in 1892 he launched his first brand of champagne. Like I said, he came from France, and I think in the Burgundy region, and he made his first brand of sparkling wine, which was, they were calling it champagne at the time, which they're not supposed to call it now after 2005, but he became known as the Champagne King of California. When my great-grandfather ended up working for him, he finished in 1913. He ended up completing a big project, and he went to go blow off steam at a local watering hole, an Italian watering hole called the Costa Hotel in San Jose, downtown San Jose. And he bumps into somebody he knew from Italy. It was Giovanni Beltramo. Now, anybody who's lived on the San Francisco Peninsula, they usually know that name, Beltramo, because the Beltramo Wine and Spirits liquor store in Menlo Park has been there for 132 years. It's been run by 5 generations of Beltramos. And
Wow.
Giovanni Beltramo was the patriarch of that lineage. And so my great-grandfather bumps into him at the card table, and Giovanni Beltramo says, "Gemello, I didn't know you were here. Where's your wife and daughter?" And he goes, "Well, I had to leave him behind in Italy, and I'm trying to make some money, and when I have the money, I'm going to send for them." And Beltramo knew what it was like to, that story hit him in the heart because he knew what it was like to be alone in a foreign country. He too had to send for his wife when he made some money. And so he loaned my great-grandfather, $190, which was the equivalent of $5,000 in today's dollars, for his wife and daughter to come and join him. So
Wow. Okay, so I remember when you mentioned Paul Masson, I remember when I was a kid, those commercials with Orson Welles.
Right.
He said, "We will sell no wine before it's time." So these are all names that are familiar to me. So So that's great. So I'm assuming he sends for your great grandmother and your grandmother, and so they come to California, and then what happens?
So about a year later or so, I mean, my great grandmother had to settle some issues, and sell some land and so forth to come over. And when she does come over, actually, she comes over around the next year or so, and my great grandfather ends up getting a job at Piketty Winery on Montebello Road in Cupertino, which is a pretty famous wine district. Now it's predominantly Ridge wineries at the top of the mountain, along with Vidovich, and there is a Piketty tasting room at the bottom there right now. But so he ends up getting a job at Piketty, and what's funny is this is a story that is on an old cassette tape that my great grandfather had recorded in the late 1970s, when he was like 97, 98, before he died at the age of almost 99. And just to fast forward a little bit, my grandfather, Grandpa Mario, in 2002 got diagnosed with prostate cancer. And so a bonding project that we did together was to transcribe these tapes. And my great-grandfather had a heavy Italian accent, so we would listen to the tape. We would stop it periodically. My Grandpa Mario would interpret what we just heard, and I would type it into my computer. So he ends up he needed a bigger house because he's no longer going to be, his bachelor days in California were going to be over, as his wife and daughter were coming. And so he tells the story on the cassette tape about renting a house just off of the Piketty property. It was owned by the Piketty brothers. And the reason why it was vacant was because there was poison oak all over the place. And the guy who was going to rent it got spooked by the poison oak. And so my Grandpa Mario stopped the tape, and he, repeated what we had just heard and said, I don't think you have to put all that. That's just trivial information. But, and I agreed. And he goes, but just put, the date that they moved in there. They moved in on New Year's Eve, 1915. And I also agreed. I thought those were trivial details. And then he goes, he also said it rained for 4 days. I don't think you have to put that either. And I said, well, wait a second. Now all those details are important. I'm starting to figure this out. And he goes, well, what do you mean? He goes, well, think about it. He was a bachelor for a year. His wife comes to live with him. They move in on New Year's Eve, 1915. It rains for 4 days. 8 months and 27 days later, you were born.
You're a quick thinker.
Yeah. So, but what's, super fascinating about the Piketty family, so the Pikettys in the 19th century, the 1800s, 1880, 1870 or so, they were working for the Jesuits of Santa Clara and making wine for the local church parishes there. And with that money, they ended up buying the property at the bottom of the hill of what became Montebello Road. Mm. And they are the ones credited with naming it Montebello, which in Italian means beautiful mountain. Mm-hmm. And so they used that money to, it's two brothers, Vincenzo and Secondo. Secondo is second in English. And those two brothers ended up building the Piketty Winery. And then Vincenzo's two sons are the ones that my great-grandfather ended up working for.
I see. Okay. So, and all of this really has, when you think of wine in California, at least most of us, we don't think of the Santa Clara Valley or the San Jose area. But what you're telling us is that this really was an epicenter for wine in the late 19th, early 20th century.
Yeah, it was actually it was a very popular industry in those days, and so when we talk about the Judgment of Paris in 1976, California had about 350 wineries. But the reason why the Judgment of Paris is so pivotal and a turning point is because California and the U.S.'s wine industry was in repair from Prohibition for 40 years. And it had peaked in that 20th century in 1910 with 1,000 wineries. And then we lost about 400 of those wineries as Prohibition was looming. And by 1920, we were down to 600 wineries. So my great-grandfather was actually working, as I said, at Piketty Winery in 1915. In 1917, he ended up taking some of the money he had made and purchased a vineyard up on top of Montebello Road. And he only held on to it for 2 years because Prohibition was looming, and he sold it in 1919 and then ended up pivoting when Prohibition became law, and pivoted into the technology of the day, which was cars. He and a couple of business partners invested in basically a traveling farmer's market, bought a fleet of trucks, and would deliver vegetables house to house throughout the Santa Clara Valley. And they would, and nowadays in Santa Clara Valley, it's wall-to-wall apartment complexes and houses. But back in those days, even in the 1970s, it was orchards spaced out between all these, every house, there were big orchards. And so you needed, some kind of mode of transportation. And, 1920s was when, cars and trucks were becoming more popular.
Yeah, it's really funny to think that most of us now, when we think of the area, what is known officially as the Santa Clara Valley, we talk about it as Silicon Valley. So it's really, unless you go there and spend a little time and dig into the history, you don't realize that the Santa Clara Valley, what is today Silicon Valley, was really an agricultural region for a long time in the
Absolutely.
20th century. Yeah. So can you maybe backtrack a little bit and let's talk about Prohibition? I mean, we all sort of have a vague idea, I think, or a lot of people, maybe some people don't know really what was Prohibition and what was its impact on the United States.
Yeah, so Prohibition was actually looming as far back as 1893, and it was really pushed by the Anti-Saloon League. And there was a guy named I'm blanking on his first name, but the last name is Wheeler, and he was actually he was traumatized as a little kid, where he got struck by a pitchfork as a little kid on his family's farm by somebody who was, really belligerent and drunk. And so that's what really pushed him to, fight against alcohol. But he wasn't really getting much traction until the early 1900s. And in 1905, he started to connect with other temperance movements. And so through that, they were able to build some steam. From between 1905 to 1917, several states had actually passed anti-liquor laws. California was not one of them. Four ballot initiatives came to the voters in California, and they all failed, and partly because had a heavy Italian and German and Irish popularity or community in San Francisco, which was the biggest city in California until maybe in the mid 1920s. And so all those anti-liquor laws failed up until one thing that really flipped the switch was a lot of states were concerned about losing the revenue that came from alcohol sales tax. But in 1916, the 16th Amendment was passed, and that's what gave us income tax, federal income tax. That's why we're paying federal income tax. So, and then that was helpful for the federal government to and the states to eliminate or not be so heavily dependent on alcohol sales tax. And so in 1920, it went into effect after it passed in 1919. And so for 14 years, alcohol was banned from 1920 to 1933. But there was a loophole in California law that my great-grandfather was able to take advantage of. And in 1925, he ended up buying a 30-acre ranch in Mountain View that he was going to eventually turn into his winery when it would get repealed in 1933. But basically, stepping back to what that loophole was, is it allowed homeowners to produce up to 200 gallons of wine for home use, which is actually a staggering amount. That's the equivalent of 3 bottles a day, every day, for 365 days a year for home use. And so my great-grandfather ended up carving out, well, I don't know exactly when he did this, but he did carve out a portion of I think he first carved out 8 acres for Zinfandel grapes. And then in 1933 or sometime after that, that vineyard ended up growing about 18 acres of Zinfandel grapes. So in 1928 or 29, he ended up, those grapes were starting to produce the ability to be harvested for wine. And by 1933, he was ready to open for business.
So there's a couple of interesting dynamics there. First of all, that there was already this movement in favor of banning alcohol. And although it didn't pass in certain states like California, and the federal government was unwilling to move on it, and I'm assuming that means the Congress, because of the tax losses, the revenue losses they would have. So what you said is then once we passed the income tax, then then Congress felt like they had an open door to go ahead and pass this policy, pass this law. And then you're saying that people knew after a while that it was eventually going to be repealed. So it seems like there's these waves of popular sentiment that come and go, and it seems like that's what happened in the 20s and 30s.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you could say that that's a pretty simplistic approach of looking at the events that unfolded. But I mean, a lot of that was, I mean, so one of the first things that happened that really I mean, it wasn't a really popular thing. It was, but also it was kind of a facade, because they never really hired the amount of enforcement that would be necessary to, you have to have all these enforcement officers going, to all these saloons and underground speakeasies to break them up, and that was rarely done. And then on top of that, in 1929, of course, we had the market crash of 1929
Right.
that sent the country into a massive depression, and then and so that's another thing that and then along with that we had bank failures, because everybody was pulling their money out of their banks and stashing it under their mattress.
Mm-hmm.
So we had 2,000 banks failing in the first 2 years of the Great Depression, and so a lot of those things also were impacting the Great Depression and Prohibition. And that's one of the things, repealing Prohibition or the 18th Amendment was one of the things that FDR campaigned on.
Oh, so by that time, it was pretty clear that the country would have been behind getting rid of Prohibition. Interesting. Yeah, and so why do you think they passed the law to begin with if they didn't put the teeth into enforcing it?
So I'm not really a historian on that, but what I do know is it was a strong, they were gaining. It was, I mean, without getting into Republican versus Democrat debates, but in that era they were. It was a political ploy to get campaign votes, really.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
you get the women temperance movement. They had a pretty strong apparatus throughout state by state, as opposed to Wheeler and his anti-saloon league before he joined forces with them. And so it was a really strong apparatus state by state to get that campaign promises for elections.
I see. So it was pretty opportunistic at the time.
Right.
Okay, so then they get through Prohibition. Prohibition is repealed, and so you can make wine again legitimately commercially. So then what happens?
Yeah, so, and actually, one other fascinating story about in Prohibition, and the whole point of Prohibition is to make it illegal to sell wine. It wasn't illegal to make wine.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can go into a grocery store and you would find a rack of grapes in the vegetable section, fruits and vegetables, and there would be a sign with instructions on how to make your own wine.
Wow.
And it would be horrible. It would be horrible wine because it was what they were selling was known as Alicante Boucher grapes, because it's very thick skin and it was easy to transport by train.
Okay.
And so that's the type of wine that homemakers were drinking during Prohibition. And then when Prohibition was repealed, we had, like I said, about 300 wineries that had survived making sacramental wine for the church, which was another loophole in Prohibition law. And then we went up to about, I think, 800 wineries pretty rapidly. But many of them went out of business almost as fast as they opened because the palate for Americans at that time was strikingly different from drinking that Alicante Boucher wine. So we ended up dropping down to 400 wineries again, and it bottomed out. I mean, things would fluctuate in the 50s, but in 1965 we bottomed out to 225 wineries, and then it would slowly increase by the time we got to 1976 with the Judgment of Paris, where we had roughly 350 wineries. When news broke that California beat France in that blind tasting that was published in Time magazine by George Tabor, who was the European correspondent for Time, California wine almost skyrocketed in demand overnight. And so over the next several years, we would start to see boutique wineries opening up. And then throughout the next 25 years, by the year 2000, we got back to 1,000 wineries. So it took 90 years to get back to where we were peaked at 1910 with 1,000 wineries.
That ends part one of my interview with author Kevin Ferguson about the story of his family and the Judgment in Paris. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the California Frontier Show. If you'd like to support the show, the best thing to do is to let other people know about it. If you'd like to support it monetarily, there are a couple ways of doing that. One is by scrolling down in your podcast app to where it says support the show. There you can become a subscriber for as little as $3 a month. And if you want to give a one-time donation, just below you'll see where it says give a one-time donation. Finally, the show is supported by California History Teachers, which is a full year of lessons for 4th grade California history and social studies. You can find out more at www.californiahistoryteachers.com. And if you input the coupon code PODCAST, you'll receive 25% off your monthly or annual subscription. So check it out.